the Atari computer. All right. This is a presentation about the Atari ST. And if you would please mute yourself. That'd be awesome. Let me do another real quick setting here. Perfect. Again, this is being recorded. All right, let's get started then. This is the Atari ST. My name is Craig Maloney, and I'll talk to you a little bit about this wonderful machine, 16-bit Atari-based computer. What we'll cover a little bit about the video game crash of 1983, because that's important to the whole story of the Atari ST. And we will also talk about Hightower and the Amiga and the Atari. We'll talk about Jack Tramiel's departure from Commodore, the purchase and creation of Atari Corp, which is separate from what was Atari Incorporated, the development of the Atari ST and GEM, and the TOS, which is the Atari ST operating system, the various models of the Atari ST, and some highlights of the software library, and a few of the community developments that have happened since the Atari Corporation's demise. What we will not cover, though, is we won't cover much of the software library of the Atari ST. I never really owned any Atari ST hardware, so I don't have a first-hand experience with it. Much of my experience with that has been through this book, which is Faster Than Light, which is by Jamie Lendino, sorry. And this is a really good guide about the Atari ST. It's got a lot of information from a owner's perspective of what the Atari ST was all about. We're also not going to cover any of the subsequent sales that happened after Atari Corp folded, or any developments in the other Atari divisions that weren't part of the Atari sale. And we won't talk about the Atari 8-bit computers. We'll talk a little bit about some of the Atari 8-bit computers that were around the time, just to give us a little bit of perspective, but we won't do any major coverage of that. So in 1983, we had the video game crash, and that was a really big deal. It really caught a lot of people unawares, because back in 1982, everyone was thinking this is just going to go up, up, up. And then it didn't really go up. And part of the problem with that was because computers were overtaking game-only systems at the time. So selling something like the Atari VCS wasn't really a long-term perspective, because even though the console kept selling and it kept selling well, it was starting to cool off. And a lot of game players wanted something that was a little more complex than the simple Atari games that were out there. The other problem was that there was a lot of Atari cartridges that were of varying quality from third-party developers. So there's a lot of discounted and unsold inventory from retailers. So they were all sending the inventory back to wherever they got it. It's like, well, we can't sell this stuff, so take it on back. Another problem was that the Atari was tried to make the 5200 the next generation console. And folks really quickly figured out that that was basically an Atari 400 that didn't have a keyboard and had some really funky controllers on it, and was completely incompatible with the old Atari 8-bit stuff without some major work. So if you really had to want the Atari 5200 because there were better options that were out there, and it was an expensive mistake for them to make, and was one that they didn't really correct until 1987. Which was unfortunately 5 years too late, because that would have been the perfect machine for them to have released around that time, but they never thought to do so. The IBM PC, you cannot underestimate how much of a shock the IBM PC was to the entire industry, because it was IBM's entry into all this stuff. It was a machine that was compatible across the board. It had a whole slew of compatible machines that were out there, and it just... I mean, your machine today shares a lot of DNA with those old machines. So, I mean, look at how far the IBM PC has come along these ways. So, you can't underestimate how much of an impact it was. And at its worst, Atari was losing $1 million a day. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't afford to lose $1 million a day, and Atari sure as heck couldn't afford to do that. So, they were in some major trouble. One little bit of note, the Atari Extra Terrestrial game gets a lot of credit for being one of the downfalls of Atari. I'm not sure it can take full credit for it, because Atari was basically doing some really not great things at the time, because they managed to get the ET license, and they paid $20 to $25 million, depending on who you talk to, for the home and arcade rights to ET. They thought it was going to be the most amazing thing. They thought all the games that were really great were because of great licensing. So what hotter property at 1983 than ET? Why not do this? So the problem was that it was never going to be a good idea. There was no way that they were going to be able to make a really good game out of this. And they were going to be able to recoup their losses. I mean, or their how much they paid for this. They would have literally had to roll a critical hit in order to make back their money on this stuff. And the problem was that ET was never going to be that game, because they managed to rush it through in about 6 weeks. And I don't know if you know about the 2600 period, but a good game usually took about 6 months in order for them to complete. So they left an unsold inventory of about 2.5 to 3 million units, which there was a documentary about how they buried all of these cartridges out in the New Mexico desert, or not a landfill out in that area. And they managed to unearth all these things. It was one of those great urban legends that was actually true. So even though they sold 1.5 million of this rushed, untested game, it was not enough. And the other problem is that the 8-bit home computers were also in kind of this weird area, because there was the Apple computer, the Apple II, which was doing gangbusters. And Atari released the home computer to try and compete with that. The problem is that they also believed that you could have a computer that really wasn't documented, that you would be fully indebted to Atari and always being able to keep purchasing software from them. And the problem was that people wanted a little bit more out of their computers. And so there was not a whole lot of documentation that you couldn't get from unofficial sources. There were things like Mapping Atari, Inside Atari DOS, the Atari Basic Source Code and whatnot. But as far as the actual official documentation for the Atari, you'd have to pay a really large amount of money to Atari in order to get that. There was De Re Atari, which was written by Chris Crawford et al. And that was an attempt to try and get some better documentation about the machine in a semi-official capacity. So there was the Atari Program Exchange, which was created to get the community. It was sort of like early shareware in a sense, where you didn't necessarily get a demo copy of the software, but you did got the community involved, and they had competitions where they would, publish any of the things that they thought was really good. And you get a nice little note from them and get royalties. And if you manage to do really well, they give you a little plaque. And First Star Software basically came out of that whole EPX thing, because Fernando Herrera, I think it was the owner of First Star Software, and that was how they got their start. So it was relatively undocumented. And the other problem was that the Atari 1200 XL was released in 1983, and they wanted to retail that machine at $1,000. And it was expensive. And the problem is that you've got the aging 400 and 800 line, which had been released around 1979, and they were starting to be steeply discounted. And selling a computer that is basically a slight revision of whatever is out there, when you're competing with the tail end of this other machine that's being steeply discounted, is just silly. Why would you do that? So they couldn't recoup any of the money that they wanted to make off of that machine. And the Commodore 64 came out, and you cannot discount the Commodore 64 because it was one of the best-selling machines out there. It was released by Commodore in 1982 as the follow-up to the VIC-20. And Jack Tramiel started a price war with everyone and said, the Commodore 64, it's got 64 kilobytes of memory. We're going to sell it for $595. So put that in stark contrast to the 1200 XL, which was then $1,000. And it's like, yeah, there's no way that you can really compete with this. And Texas Instruments couldn't compete with that at all. They got knocked out of the computer market because they couldn't compete any longer, because their machine was horrifically expensive. Expanding it was expensive as all get out. And so they folded up shop, and that was it. So that was the Commodore 64 was just an amazingly revolutionary machine at the time because it revolutionized the price, and it basically set off the next stage of the computing industry. So Jack Tramiel, I don't know if anyone is familiar with Jack Tramiel. He was an amazing fellow. Born December 13th, 1928, was a Holocaust survivor in Auschwitz and was liberated in 1945 by the 84th Infantry Division of the United States Army. And he actually got to meet the person that liberated him a while back, and it was really touching to see that. Joined the Army in 1947 and helped him fix a lot of the office equipment, including the typewriters, which basically set his course for what he was going to do later on in life. 1953, he was working as a taxi driver and bought an office repair shop in the Bronx and secured a $25,000 loan from the U.S. Army entitlement and named it Commodore Portable Typewriter. So yeah, Jack is an amazing person. He was incredibly, deadly serious when it came to business. His tagline was "Business is war," and he meant it. He got the reputation of being the Attila the Hun of the computing industry, and I don't think he is definitely a very, very serious man. And so you also have Irving Gould. And the problem with Irving Gould is that literally this is all the information that I could find out about Irving Gould. And I'm not really going to go through a whole heck of a lot of it. This is all on Wikipedia. Just know that you really don't know a whole lot about Irving Gould. But what he did have is he had a lot of money, and he was able to float Commodore some loans. And so he became part of the ownership of Commodore. And so he was a pivotal figure during this time because he was also looking to recoup a lot of his investment. He'd been floating the company for about 25 years and wanted to recoup some of his investment and get some of the benefit out of this. And so before I get too far into this, there is an aside on history. A lot of these things that I am telling you are from a historical perspective, and history is very fungible for a lot of folks. There's a lot of folks that don't really remember things or remember things really differently from each other. And so there are certain stories where it's like someone will tell it one way, someone will tell another way. They'll remember different facts and whatnot. So what I am telling you is a synthesis of a lot of different stories. So take that with the appropriate grains of salt. And let's move on then. Because this is a really weird time because Jack Tramiel left Commodore. And in 1984, he left them. And the reason stated at the time was that Irving Gould felt that Jack was taking over the company. Jack had several sons, Sam Tramiel and Leonard Tramiel. And it was rumored that he was trying to position them as key positions of the company and try and put them in higher level areas of management. Never mind that I think Leonard wasn't working at the time at Commodore at all, but be that as it may, he was going to try and put him into a leadership position. And this is the reason that filtered throughout the press. And this is something that I remember reading at the time, is that Jack was trying to elevate his sons who were no good at whatever it was that they were doing, but he was going to try and push them through. And to me, that's not the case. And Leonard Tramiel said that the reason that Jack left was because Irving Gould wanted to recoup his investment. And at CES, 1984 CES, he confronted Irving Gould and said, you can't do that. You can't pull money out of this company. Because I think he realized that going up was not always going to continue happening. And so he was he was worried that they were going to pull out the cushion that he had built up in this company. And he said, you can't do that while I'm president. And Irving Gould was like, bye, see you later. No need for you anymore. And the story, and there's a link to this whole story, was that earlier it was Jack Tramiel's, he wanted a certain model of Corvette. And that model of Corvette, his sons managed to find the exact model with the exact interior and all this other kind of stuff. And Jack Tramiel, after having left Commodore, had no way of getting back home other than that Corvette. And so they drove that Corvette back home. So, I mean, talk about a high point and a low point all in the same day. It's like, here's your Corvette, you're fired. So Jack Tramiel, time passed over this time. And Jack Tramiel managed to come up with his own company, which is Jack Tramiel technology, and it left the I off so that people could actually pronounce Tramiel better, because otherwise everyone's going Tramiel, and it's not that. On July 1984, Tramiel Technology bought the consumer division of Atari Incorporated. Warner wanted out. Warner was getting sick and tired of losing all their money, and they thought, well, these video game things are a fad. These computer things just not going to work out. We need a buyer. And the reason that Tramiel bought the Atari was because Atari was the second most recognized trademark in the world. And he figured that he could pivot this into his new venture and go up against Commodore, which was now his mortal enemy. So Atari experienced heavy layoffs when Tramiel came into Atari. So you had a company that was at 2,000, a lot of management, unfortunately, and then it was reduced to around 200 people. And this was announced over the PA. Imperial stormtroopers have entered the base. Imperial stormtroopers have, and they hit the hook on the phone. And unfortunately, Jack Tramiel, reminder, was a Holocaust survivor. He was not a Star Wars fan. I don't think he had ever seen the Star Wars movies. And so he later it was explained to him that this is funny, and I'm sure that he eventually might have believed it. Not entirely sure, though. Anyways, there's a story about the Atari Amiga. And so Hi-Toro was a company that was started by Jay Miner, Larry Kaplan, and several other ex-Atari folks, including Joe DeCour. Unfortunately, Joe DeCour never really got the credit that he deserved for it, because there was going to be lawsuits if it came about that he was on it. They managed to line up $7 million in funding from a group of dentists, of all things. So they initially created some peripherals for the 2600 while working on the Lorraine project, which was the 16-bit computer that they were working on that later on became the Commodore Amiga. The video game crash meant that all of their funding basically it evaporated, because video games no longer a thing. Just pull all the money out, whatever. And so they got a loan from Atari for about $500,000 that needed to be paid back in 1 month. And I think the reasoning at the time was that, well, these folks will never manage to get it, and we'll get some really neat chips out of the deal. Win-win. So it's like, whatever. Here's $500,000. And there's an apocryphal tale that one of the designers went in and gave Jack Tramiel a check and then turned on his heel and walked out, as their way of basically saying, you aren't getting this. And it was because of Commodore that came in and decided to use this technology and basically make it so that Atari couldn't get it. And whether that's true or not, again, history is fungible, but it makes for a really good story. And so then Tramiel countersued Amiga and probably even Commodore. I don't know exactly what. And on August 13th, 1984, that happened. He saw damages and an injunction, but I think it was basically to buy time so that Commodore couldn't really do anything with the technology, because he was working on his own, and that was the Atari ST. And that was designed in 6 months, which is, again, an amazing feat. You couldn't get an Atari 2600 cartridge to market in 6 months. Or you could, and if you rushed it, bad things happen. They managed to get the entire computer basically prototyped in 6 months. So it was from August 1984 to the CES the next year. So they were showing it in front of all these people on January 1985. Shiraz Shivji led the team of 6 engineers to design the Atari ST, and Shiraz was previously working on the Commodore 64. So Jack brought some of his lieutenants and all of his trusted folks onto this project. They didn't have a whole lot of custom chips. The Amiga was famous for having some amazing custom chips because he had Jay Miner on there. So Jay was, he did all the custom chips for the 2600 and the 400 and 800, along with Joe DeCour and all that. So this was a very, very simple system, and it came to bite them later on, but that was not what they were looking for. They weren't looking to go up against the Amiga. They were really looking to go up against the Macintosh, which had just been in the Lisa, which were around that same time. The 520 ST case was designed by Ira Valinsky, And there was originally supposed to be a 130 ST and a 260 ST with 128K and 256K respectively. But the 260 ST was only released in Europe, and that was because Europe, sending machines over to Europe, they were really expensive, and so you needed to have a lower cost device over there. And so that was, that option, but it quickly evaporated once the memory chips and that came down in cost. Here's a schematic, and not a schematic, but at least a block diagram of what the Atari ST looks like. And we'll go over some of these things in more detail on what's in there. But the main thing to notice is that there's a lot of basically off-the-shelf chips that are on here. The only thing that really isn't off the shelf is the memory controller, the glue chip, and the video shifter. Everything else is pretty much off the shelf. So you've got the ST shifter, which enabled bitmap graphics using 32 kilobytes of contiguous memory. And screen addresses needed to be a multiple of 256. The glue was a generalized logic unit, and that was to connect everything together. So you had the MMU, which was to make sure that you could actually get access to the memory on the machine. It wasn't quite the same as the later models of the 68,000 based machines, where you could actually do all that lovely memory management and stuff. And then the DMA, which was for doing the floppy and hard drive data transfers. Then you also had several other support chips. I'm not going to go into these in too much detail. The one that really stands out to me, though, is the Western Digital floppy disk controller, and then the Yamaha YM2149, which is basically the same chip, just different pinout and whatnot that the ZX Spectrum used. So it was a capable chip, but it wasn't really a fantastic sound chip. It was good for the time. It was very good for a 1982 style chip. So you had the ST starting off at $799.99 monochrome and $999.99 for the color. And so you're talking about 800 and 1,000 versus the Commodore 64, which at retail was supposed to be around $600. And that included the monitor. So this is real. I mean, you're talking in the span of only a few years, the 16-bit computers were starting to come into that same period and that same price range. You had 512K of onboard non-expandable memory. Again, the Yamaha chip that I referenced earlier. And yes, the monochrome monitor on the ST was astounding. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It initially shipped with a single-sided 3.5 floppy drive storing 360 kilobytes. And later on, they stored 720. And it had the same Motorola chip, the 68,000 that was in the Macintosh and the Amiga, but they clocked it at 8 megahertz. Surprisingly enough, being at that 8 megahertz was actually a huge improvement. It was much faster than some of the other machines. Like the Amiga was at like some weird 7.1 megahertz or such. But anyways, and it also had, 714, thank you. And it also had TOS, which is the operating system. And that was installed in ROM. And it was 192 kilobytes. And here's a little bit of the pinouts of the machine. You'll notice the prominent MIDI ports, which any Atari ST owner will tell you was on the machine from day one and was there throughout the entirety of the machine. You also had joystick ports and a not very overutilized cartridge port because it only supported about 128 kilobytes. And here's the inside of the machine as well. It is a beauty to look at, though, isn't it? So TOS was designed cooperatively, and I use the air quotes because digital research and Atari really didn't get along with each other very well because digital research thought that they were the shit, and so did Atari. And Atari had video game programmers that actually knew what they were doing. And it was based on Crystal, which was later rechristened as GEM desktop environment, which was a Macintosh-like operating system that was designed primarily on the IBM 8086 processors and had 8086 assembly language in there. And so porting it over to the 68,000 was a bit of a challenge. They also signed a contract for CPM 68K. And if you've ever used CPM compared to DOS, CPM is definitely, it's an older operating system, and it had some issues as far as like directory management and whatnot. Having that ported over to the 16-bit era might have been a little bit, it might have hampered the machine a lot more than it should have. And later on, they managed to port it over GEM-DOS to it. So it was a little more capable and a little more IBM PC compatible, at least as far as the floppy format. Like I said, there was a lot of friction between Atari and DRI. And unfortunately, yeah, it was not something that was going to be easily resolved. And there was lots of stories about it. And if you head over to Dad Hacker, which I had the link in there before, he's got some stories about their contentious relationship. So in December, the ROMs were not ready for installation on the finished machine. And so the early development machines had an extra bit of RAM on there in order to accommodate the operating system that should be there, but wasn't. And so they created a boot ROM for it called DOS Boot. You can find a demo of it on Reddit. And the funny thing is that it's actually pretty spectacular for just a small little boot ROM. And it was basically the video game programmers from Atari basically saying, here's what we can do in the small amount of space and a little time, you DRI folk. Anyways, so TOS was a single tasker operating system. So the Amiga had preemptive multitasking. Unfortunately, TOS did not. It was very similar to what the Macintosh was at the time, although the Macintosh, I think, was slightly better about it because you could at least get to the Finder, or at least you weren't completely stuck in your application. And so if you had to do anything as far as getting access to the disk or whatnot, you're kind of screwed. But you could run accessories on there. And so they shipped with several accessories, like a calculator, a VT52 terminal emulator, and a control panel. Were shipped as accessories. And so if you had those on the floppy disk as well, you could double click on that and then use some of your precious memory to run those particular tasks. And later on, there were versions that were multitasking, preemptively multitasking. There was Magic and Mint, which became later Multitos, but that didn't come around until the late 80s and early 90s. So the timeline, you've got 1984, the Tramiels buy Atari and basically lay off everyone and shove them all into a single building. The ST hardware becomes a little clearer in August. There was more work done. And this is the entire timeline basically of the operating system and how it was released. January 1985, again, CES running CPM 68K. And then the decision to move to a new file system as well. The 16K boot ROM showed up in February. Even more work in March. In April, the ROMs actually do work. And then in May, the ROMs actually ship. So really compressed timeline and pretty much an achievement in any book. July 1985, the machine's released. It includes the computer, power supply, and a monochrome or color monitor. And you get a language disk along with it, which included NEOChrome, which is an amazing piece of paint software. ST Basic, which was a passable BASIC, but you couldn't ship any machine basically in the 1980s without a serviceable BASIC. It also had Logo on it, which I think is one of the few times that Logo actually was shipped with a computer. I think Texas Instruments, I don't know if they actually shipped anything with it, like right out of the box, but you could get it. But so shipping Logo with it was really impressive. And again, the desk accessories, as well as the printer RS-232 configuration. And later editions had different software on there. And then there were, over in the European market, there were discovery packs, which actually included a lot of really, really neat software. Some of the notable early ST software, like I said, there was NEOChrome, which you see a picture of it on the right-hand side. ST Writer, which was basically a port of Atari Writer because they didn't have a word processor on this machine. So what they did is they took what was there in Atari Writer and basically did a conversion of that. And I don't know if you've ever used Atari Writer, but it was basically a text editor with a little bit of bold, a little bit of italicization, and some printer support. And that's about it. It wasn't set up for the GEM desktop operating system at all. There's also a pixel perfect port of Joust as well, which was really impressive. Degas, which is another exciting paint program. Megamax C, which had a better C compiler than what the Atari ST development kit came with. The Atari ST development kit came with DRI's compiler and whatnot, and they were pretty bare bones. I'm not sure if you, I mean, think basically command line, but slightly worse and a little bit buggier. Serviceable. I mean, you could write software with it. Later, it was released as Laser C, and then Megaroids. Funnily enough, one of the good games of the computer was released with the C compiler as well, but it also includes a source so you could take a look at it and do your own gaming with it. Time Bandit and Sundog Frozen Legacy, which is a Space Terriers type game, and that's an image of it over on the right. Oh, did we mention that we had MIDI? Yeah, there was MIDI on there, and what was neat about it is because it booted really quickly and was really roadworthy. I mean, so a lot of musicians started using the Atari ST. And so you had a lot of prominent musicians that were using it as part of their music production. And because it's a serial interface, you could also use it for, yeah, and that's this one. You're tipping my hand. There was a game that was used MIDI for it, which was MIDI Maze, which is an impressive feat because it was basically LAN gaming before there was really LANs. Anyways, so you could go around and basically blow up happy faces. So that's what kept us entertained back in the 1980s. There's also a video of that Atari put out to try and convince more musicians to pick up these machines. And you'll see over in the left-hand corner, there's an Atari Mega ST off on the side. And I'm not sure if that's the case. I think it is. If Faceball 2000 is the descendant of MIDI Maze. I don't know the direct lineage of it. I apologize. And also Tangerine Dream. Not only are they sporting amazing haircuts, but they're also sporting an Amiga ST over on the left-hand side as well. And also, I think if you look over in the top right, there's also a couple of them over there. So yeah, there are a lot of musicians that really went in deep into the Atari ST ecosystem. And then there was 85 and 86. So many of the games that showed up on the ST, it was a weird time because there were games that would show up on the ST first and then get ported over to the Amiga. And then the Amiga started becoming the platform that people started writing for. And so things started trickling back. But it took a while for people to really get their heads around working on a 16-bit computer. And so the software was, it was starting to get there. Some of them took advantage of the GEM desktop, though, which was kind of nice. And I think, honestly, my own subjective opinion is that things that took advantage of the GEM desktop really started making the machine shine. So if doing a straight port of something like from an IBM PC or something like that wasn't going to really cut it. You had to actually cut your teeth on what exactly GEM was doing for you. And the problem is then you were kind of locked into what GEM was doing. And so then you could try and port it back over to the IBM, but then you started having to use the whole GEM operating environment on the IBM machine. And I used the GEM environment on the IBM machine. It wasn't bad. It was just the Windows was starting to show up around that time. But the Atari 1040 ST showed up, and that was released in 1986 and managed to get itself on the front cover of Byte magazine. In part because it was the first machine that shipped with 1 megabyte of memory, and it was the first machine to really break the $1,000 to megabyte price range, which was phenomenal at the time. I mean, thinking about a machine that had 1 megabyte of memory was just impressive. I mean, this had never really been done before. And they managed to jam the floppy drive and the power supply into that whole case. The only downside is they also managed to jam the joystick ports underneath the numeric keypad, so you had to lift the machine up in order to actually get to them, which is a slight downside. And here's the whole cover story on it, and you can see that lovely machine sitting over there in the corner there. Mega ST showed up a little later on. That was released in 1 megabyte, 2 megabyte, and 4 megabyte models, and it's a handsome machine. I really enjoy that form factor. It had a detached keyboard with a better feel than the 520 and 1040 ST. So it actually had proper rubber domes as opposed to what weird spring thing they were using in that computer. It had an onboard real-time battery back clock, which sounds absolutely pedestrian nowadays, but was phenomenal, that you could actually keep time on your machine, and it would keep the time on your machine even when you powered it off. Essentially, it was the 1040 ST, but with a little bit more memory. But it also had the blitter chip, and the blitter chip was amazing because the regular draws on the Atari ST were not that fast. There was, in order to do any kind of video gaming, because again, Jack Tramiel was not the type of person that would buy a video game company. He bought the computer company, he bought the brand, and then built the computer company around it. He didn't care one whit about the video game stuff, but the video game programmers did. And so they created something called A-Line, which subverted the GEM operating system so that you could actually do something with it. Well, the blitter chip made that even faster. So then the GEM desktop actually ran at a reasonable pace. Unfortunately, it was also not on the earlier machines, so very few things took advantage of that, which is unfortunate. They positioned this machine as the desktop publishing machine. So they had a printer which would use some of that 4 megabytes of sweet RAM. So they didn't have to put it inside the printer. They could put it inside the computer, which was slightly cheaper. And so then they could create a computer that didn't have, they could create a printer that didn't have to have all that expensive memory in it. And then they could pair them both together. And they marketed it really well. They marketed it as a $4,000 machine with 4 megabytes of memory and a hard drive, 30 megabyte hard drive, printer, and a monitor. So it was basically a complete desktop publishing package for about $4,000. Again, pretty impressive. They also had the Stacy, which has the distinction of being one of the early laptop ideas that really didn't think things through quite the way that they should have. It was great. I mean, you had a portable Atari ST machine with TOS 1.04 on it, along with the blitter chip and an optional modem. And they worked it out through all of the various Atari manufacturing errors to finally get everything working. Had 4 different models. It had the 1 megabyte model, it had a couple 2 megabyte models, and a 4 megabyte model. The problem was it ran off of 12 C batteries. And that is a problem because C batteries and laptops did not go very well. When they realized that it was insufficient to power the machine, they didn't, just think, well, we'll try and figure out how to shove more batteries in there. They just glued the lid shut on it and said, it's a portable machine, but you got to plug it in. We're done. We're not going to worry about this. Because I don't think this thing would have probably made it through the airport terminal, let alone a flight, in order to actually keep powered. So really good first attempt at this whole laptop thing. There's the STE, which stands for ST Enhanced. That was released in 1989 with the blitter support, but it also had 4,096 possible colors, Genlock for video, because the Amiga was basically eating Atari's lunch in that entire arena, and PCM audio, so you could actually use the whole computer to do all of your sampling and all that other kind of stuff. And the RAM could be updated using SIMs. Yay, SIMs! None of this on, desoldering sockets and all this other kind of stuff. We have SIMs now. Unfortunately, it also had the same problem as most of these machines, which is not really compatible with the earlier stuff and very little software support for the later stuff. And part of that can be attributed to piracy. Part of that can be attributed to everyone realizing that the IBM PC had caught up and that the Macintosh had finally gotten color and all the other stuff that the Atari ST didn't have at the time. And so the value proposition of going with the ST wasn't really there anymore. And then the Mega STE also had an FPU option as well, so you could do floating point and get some really fast calculations on it, along with VME, a network port, and TOS 2.0. And here's all the wonderful, wonderful things that you can find out about the STE and the features on it. And again, being able to synchronize the video timings is great. Socketed stuff, better audio chip, all that other wonderful stuff. And then the TT30 came out, and that was the 3232. That was the 32-bit model. And they were going to take over the Unix workstation market, except that Unix didn't show up on the machine until 2 years after it was released, which makes it very difficult to tackle the Unix workstation market if you have no Unix on it. So it was released in 1990 with a 68030, but it was also $3,000. And again, the other models, they're selling it with, the hard drive, the printer, and all that other stuff, but they want you just to buy the whole machine for $3,000. And later on, they repurposed this case for the Mega STE. There was the ST Book as well, which is an extremely handsome machine, and was released in 1991. Had a 640 by 400 LCD, which is basically the monochrome resolution. Had TOS 2.6 on it, and was extremely portable, and managed to keep the 2 MIDI ports on there. Apple, and was a very handsome machine. I wish I had put the slide in there of what the back of it looked like. Anyways, moving on. The Falcon 30 was really the last of the ST models. And this is an incredible machine. It's also one of those machines that if you can find it, that's great, because it is a handsome machine, but it's also handsomely rare, which is unfortunate because it was the 68030 model, which had a 16-bit addressing bus, which kind of didn't served the machine very well, but it also supported sampling very well on there, and it was the last of the ST models. And it did get some clones. There was C-Lab, which licensed the Falcon design and made a few modifications and whatnot. But again, if you manage to see these in the wild, consider yourself lucky, because this is a pretty rare machine. And then in 1993, because Atari realized that their legacy was basically that of a video game company, and the computer stuff wasn't really selling, and they were starting to do more PC-based clones, they shifted all their focus over to the Atari Jaguar. There was a rumored Atari Panther, which was based off of the ST stuff, but it never really materialized. And there's a few links of prototype stuff of what might have been had they decided to go that route. Unfortunately, though, Atari wasn't long for this world, because in 1996, they agreed to a reverse merger with JTS, which is a storage company. And so Atari Corporation basically ceased to exist at that point, which is unfortunate, because to my mind, the Atari ST was a triumph of engineering. The fact that they managed to get something set up in 6 months, and then basically a year and a half, they got it into market, was phenomenal. And this machine was an incredibly good machine. I think it should have had a lot better lifespan. And unfortunately, I was also the person that had an Atari 8-bit and was very jealous of the attention that the younger sibling was getting. So I never really glommed on to the Atari ST. I was still the Atari 8-bit was perfectly serviceable for me, which is unfortunate, because I think this would have been a good match. Had there been more forward compatibility, especially with the Blitter chip, I think it might have been more graphically competitive with some of the other machines. But unfortunately, writing for the lowest common denominator was very popular during that time. Like the Amiga later models received the scant attention. And unfortunately, Jack's reputation at Commodore of being the Attila the Hun of the computer market basically caused a lot of friction. So a lot of companies flatly refused to port their software. There's piracy as well. That was pretty high on everyone's radar. Every magazine had something about, is piracy killing our computers? The answer was probably. They believed in creating a developer machine, and it was really easy to develop, but it was also weird for a lot of folks that were coming from the era of BASIC and 6502 and now having to move to a 68000. The 68000 was a nice processor to develop for. It took a little bit of that ramp up time, and I don't think Atari really had that time to spend on it. They pitted the Atari ST against the Amiga because Jack was from Commodore, and so you got to pit. Everyone loves a good story. Everyone loves a good story. The problem is that they should have concentrated on the Macintosh, because the Macintosh was eating the lunch, and really the Atari ST was the competitor for the Macintosh. I think they would have been more well served competing with the Macintosh, because they really had the edge on the Macintosh at the time. And the other problem is that Atari Corporation was similar to Atari Incorporated, only in name only. Had they realized the video game legacy and really started working on and capitalizing on that, they might have had a little more success. The problem was it didn't seem like the smart thing to do at the time, because computers at the time were productivity. And give me a second. But they were really focusing more on productivity. So some of the neat stuff about the Atari ST was, and somebody alluded to this in chat, the ability to run Spectre and Magic Sack. These were various ways of doing emulation of the Macintosh. So all you needed was some Macintosh ROMs, and with the transporter, you could have yourself a very, very inexpensive Macintosh. I don't think this made anyone over in Cupertino very happy, unfortunately. But yeah, it was one thing that you could do with it. Other neat things is that in the character set, there is the image of J.R. Bob Dobbs. So if you print out all of these things, you can see the visage of J.R. Bob Dobbs. And so there's a few Michigan connections as well. There is Abacus, which is a book publisher based out of Grand Rapids that republished some books. I think they were originally from Europe for the United States audience. Some of these books are incredibly good. I've got a collection of those downstairs that I've neglected to bring upstairs. Mishtron, formerly Computer Shack, was based out of Southfield and published a lot of classic Atari ST titles. And Sheldon Lehman wrote some of the definitive Atari ST books on VDI, EES, and TOS as well, and was based out of Michigan. So there's a curious path to today, and I'm going to breeze through this rather quickly. Caldera. Some of us may remember some of Caldera and its Linux lineage. They acquired the assets of Digital Research in the attempt to try and create a thin client around in 1990. And Linneo and Caldera realized that this wasn't going to work. And rather than just keep holding on to this asset, they decided to release it as a GPL. Funny story, because the GPL allowed folks to then take some of those sources and then turn them into EmuTOS. And that is a clean room implementation of TOS. So you have a GPL version of the Atari ST operating system available for you now. So you can take a look at the source code of it, which is really, really cool, because not only it started in 1999, but it's now hit its 1.0 release in 2020, and it is really rock solid. Funnily enough, this can also run on Amigas and Apple Lisas and such. So if you want to get the full Atari experience, but don't want to have Atari hardware polluting your environment, you could run it on any of this hardware. It also runs on emulators as well. It's really compatible. Once I understood what it was doing, I finally got it to run a lot of stuff, and it is really rock solid. So if you want to check out a free implementation of this, by all means, check it out. And here's an image of it. On the left side is the boot screen of it, and on the right side is what it looks like as it's running in an emulator, which is Hatari. Hatari is an emulator of Atari ST hardware, and it's the one that I'm going to feature in this presentation. There's a couple others as well for Windows. There's Steam. There's I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but it's basically a 68,000 emulator. This also was released under the GPL and started around the same time as EmuTOS, around 2001, to keep cycle accurate emulation. And they just celebrated the 20th anniversary, which is really cool. And so there's some history of it. If you look at the mailing list link here, it is fascinating to see just how far this stuff has come. And there's also modern hardware. So if you want to get your modern hardware fix, you can pick up something like the Firebee, which is a hardware clone of the Atari Falcon with a Coldfire CPU. So the Coldfire is like a 68,000 base CPU. It's like, I think it's a 60, they call it a 68060 or something like that. I don't know entirely all the details of it, but it's really cool to see. And also you can use MIDI ports on it. There's also Mist and Mister, which are FPGA versions of that, and you can pick those up. And again, those have the lovely little MIDI ports on it. Can't have an Atari ST without MIDI ports, just saying. Can't be done. Are there any questions? I know I ran slightly over, but is there any questions about this?
Very awesome history presentation, though. Wow, you bring back tons of memories. Thank you, Craig. Nicely done.
Thank you. And I will have links to this. I'll make the slides available. So by all means, please check out all this stuff. Faster Than Light, again, is an excellent resource on the Atari ST. Definitely a breezy read. Any networking capability besides MiniNet? I'm not the person to ask on that, unfortunately. I think there was, but I don't know offhand, unfortunately. So with that, I will, again, this has been recorded. So if anyone doesn't want their countenance on here, by all means, please let me know. But if not, I will try and post this up as soon as I can, and I'll get the slides up. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great time at Penguicon.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.